Hello, everyone. It's always a pleasure to have a columnist visit us in the newsroom. And today it's a little more special because we have Trinh Nguyen visiting us from Hong Kong. She's a senior economist for emerging Asia at Natixis. And obviously, she has deep expertise on the region. And today we'd like to draw on that expertise to understand where India and Asia stand against the canvas of the world. Trinh, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for being in the newsroom with us. Let's get right to it, right? Let's dive right into the main thing that everyone's talking about, which is Trump, right? What would you say is the Trump factor doing to India? Are we really losing a lot, or do you think it's just transient and it's going to go away soon?
Well, Trump is increasing access to the U.S. market, increasing barriers to access to the U.S. market, which is the biggest in the world, and it's the biggest for India. And so, therefore, I think it's hugely consequential. It's consequential because it is at a juncture where India is finally looking outward, because traditionally it's looked very much inward. And it's finally looking outward through Make in India, through efforts to liberalize market access. And it's doing so in its own way, but it's kind of finally looking outward as suddenly the outward world, where it makes a lot of margins, are shutting down a bit, right? So I do think for India, the fact is that exports as a share of GDP is still small.
Yeah.
Manufacturer exports as a share of GDP is still small, and the exposure to the US is only 2% of GDP. So, which means what India is looking outward to do is to grow that more, to take more of what China has lost in terms of access to the US, and not just the US, but also the rest of the world. Now, I think for India, the opportunity is lost in terms of easy growth, but it doesn't mean that it cannot still grow via exporting its way out. And it kind of, in a way, in my opinion, is taking a step back in terms of, well, maybe perhaps we had the right to fear. Maybe the fact that our Achilles heel is that we have low exposure export is a strength right now, because it means that it limits the fallout. And I think that can be detrimental to the momentum, the risk appetite that India has, which is to continue to liberalize, to expose its domestic market to much more foreign competition,
Right.
to excel onshore and offshore, right?
Right.
So I do think that it does have that negative consequence. And beyond friction to trade, it also raises a big question regarding the idea of India plus one, right? China plus one for India.
Right.
Obviously, I think that idea is always about not just diversifying away from China as a place to do supply chains, but diversifying as a domestic demand. Right. China was seen as a big market that was growing, but increasingly very difficult for foreign players to compete within China, and even for Chinese firms, because it's highly competitive. They have deflation. So everyone was kind of moving outward from China, not just foreign investors, but also Chinese industrialists. And India is seen as, well, this is the only alternative to China, given the sheer size of the population, the potential growth, and the fact that where it is, there's a lot of room for it to grow. So therefore, this is where actually, where growth, where it's fiercely competitive, we can actually have that as a final domestic demand market. So India is positioning itself as that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is true. In the growth. But the question is whether or not it can grow the middle class to eventually be that big market, right, for a lot of these multinationals looking to find for sources of growth. And to do that, there's a big challenge at the moment, which is how to grow jobs. Right. Because in order for you to grow the middle class, job growth is an important consideration.
Right. Do you think India is ready to look outward, as you said? I mean, do you think, I mean, we obviously have to export to high margin and big markets, right? Do you think we're, in terms of the framework, we're ready for it? And where does that leave BRICS?
So India always has this idea that, well, we want to liberalize the international, to the international trade, but liberalization when our domestic industries are not ready, then it's like letting the wolves, letting the wolves, slaughter the lamb, so to
Right.
speak, and the domestic industries of that. So let's just protect it. Let's put up some fences. So actually, after liberalization, tariffs have actually gone higher. So there's still significant barriers. The UK FTA shows that it's willing to liberalize, but it's doing so, if you look at the auto sector, in such a gradual way, right? And in a specific high-end segment, with quotas and tariffs going down slowly over time. And it's still not touching our culture, dairy, and so on and so forth. So I do think that, for that to happen, then let's just say, okay, if India is not ready because it thinks that its domestic industries need help, so what can we do domestically, right? What can India do domestically to kind of strengthen the domestic sector, so therefore they can go out and compete, right? Because within the domestic industries, India is competing with international trade, right? So while it may not want to open up its wall of tariffs, it's still facing a lot of imports. It's importing energy because it needs that. And that's another geopolitical touch point. But even Russia or not, it still needs to import energy. And that's an Asian story. It's nothing unique. It's importing tons of stuff from China, like 110 billion roughly. It's gone up since. And that a lot of that is not just intermediates, capital intensive. It's also consumer goods, in every spectrum of manufacturing, right? What that tells you is that there's a lot of room to beef it up. So do I think India is ready? It is ready from a mindset because it knows what it means to shy away from the world. And as it's preparing to be ready, the world looks increasingly scarier. But at the same time, being at home isn't so comforting, right? Because competition still finds you at home, right? Because of inefficiencies domestically, so a lot of manufacturers find it just easier to import. Now, then there's that question. So we have reforms, the GST rationalization. I think there's still a lot of room to do. But what's next? What's on this menu to beef up the domestic industries? And that's what I was coming to India to look for, because investors constantly always ask me, we know this is what's needed, and there's a menu of wish lists. So what's next? What is the optimal reforms that can be done right now that is least costly politically, right? So it's the most politically
quick and
efficient,
effective,
reforms.
That's correct.
Obviously, everyone's shying away from agri because it's a minefield. So what can we do? And I think we've seen that. So we saw labor reforms being passed, but yet implemented. So the question is, will we touch on that? Right. What about land, and so on and so forth. So this is what I came to India looking. I'm looking for more risk appetite, right? Policy risk appetite. Certainly the rhetorical direction is there, and I wonder if it's gonna seize that. And and another question I have is that I don't have an answer. I'm looking for an answer. Is whether there's demand as well, because risk appetite comes from policymakers, but whether or not the domestic audience, other than being pissed off at Trump, right, for what is seen as somewhat unfair, because when India is finally ready, it's actually getting the highest tariffs, right? So I do think that. So is it? Let me just go back to your question. Then the answer is, I would say yes and no, because yes, in that it's ready with a caveat. We need to strengthen the domestic, and in order to that, we need to make all these different leaps of reforms. But yet we're not going to do that just yet, and we will, but we don't know where, and if now is not the time, when is it going to be?
Right, right,
right?
right. So if that happens, do you think it's very easy for a country like India to fall into that domestic demand trap as compared to, I mean, of course, exports? And I mean, to just touch upon what you said, we've been seeing multiple indications that demand is slowing in some areas, right, in the country. And of course, GST 2, as the government calls it, is an attempt to basically give that stimulus to the economy. The central bank, of course, also is making moves. Do you think all of these making any difference at this point?
Actually, there's plenty of room to just fix within India, right? So a good example of what I mentioned is that the trade deficit. So the trade deficit is not just essentials, but this huge manufacturing deficit. So the fact is, the deficit with China is much greater when it exports to the U.S. And if it can plug that, obviously it cannot plug everything because you still need essential inputs for production that you don't have. But there are many things you could create here. So
Right.
the question is, why then do we have this challenge, right? So I do think that that can be solved. And India, if you look at its relationship with BRICS, for the most part, it is where people sell things to. So India, as a domestic demand,
Right.
is a big market for a lot of these countries, right? And so yes, I would say that that is yes. Second thing is that if you look at the corporate sector, private investment remains quite weak.
Yeah.
I mean, it has been broadening now and it's improving, but it's weak still relative to what the government has done. So there's plenty of room for that to grow. And the fact that leverage is low means that there's room for it to grow. Now, how do we get there? Right? How do
Right.
we get there where we can reduce some of this friction where the risk appetite goes higher, right? For private investors in India. So I would say to have much greater risk appetite in terms of policy taken from the government to kind of accelerate, remove friction, which will then will lead to much greater risk appetite within the country. And I think that ingredient for growth is there because for a country with huge burgeoning demand, and so what's really missing to push it from the six-ish growth figure or five-ish or six
Right.
is really the investment side of the equation. And when we look at the investment side of the equation, it's the private investment side because the government obviously is trying to consolidate, improve its fiscal, and there's only so much more debt it can take. Then you really have that private sector becoming important. And where is that private investment coming from? It could be coming from Indians themselves, Indian corporates doing more capex, and also foreign investors investing into India, right?
Right.
Investing into not just to export out, but to give you the fact that huge demand here for infrastructure, huge demand for energy, huge demand for lots of things, right? Industrial goods to be produced here. So all of that can be plugging the gap, right?
Right, right. If we just go back to the Trump tariffs briefly, and you spoke about how the India-UK trade deal has indicated that India has remained largely protectionist about the auto sector, and then of course people have been talking about the red line that has been drawn when it comes to agri and dairy. In these key sectors, do you think this is basically a? I mean, what do you think is likely going to be the movement forward from the perspective of these sectors in the India-US trade deal?
Oh, I think it's very difficult. So for us, so red lines. So I think for India, obviously it's an emotional issue. Because so many people are employed in this sector and they're very just small scale farmers. If you open it up for big US industrials and with the scale, how can we compete? So that's just on the scale basis. And then obviously there's the value. We don't want GMO and so on and so forth. But the reality is that while exporting soybeans and finding an alternative to the Chinese market, which obviously is the biggest importer of US soybeans, which the market now has diminished because China, in retaliation, is buying less, right? And so while that is important for the U.S., I don't think that's the most important sticking point, right? But the reality is, if you're not gonna buy more soybeans, what will India buy more from the U.S.?
Right.
And what does it offer in terms of this big market, right? So I do think that there are other sectors that are much more palatable, like auto, that can be given as a trade-off. But the auto sector may not want that,
Yeah,
right? So India is the third largest auto market in the world, but it imports very few, right? From the U.S. I think the number is like 1,000 vehicles or something like this, given the high tariff. So that is something that is a difficult one. But I think, when we focus on too much detail, sometimes we get bogged down. A good example I would say is Vietnam. Vietnam faced in the 40s tariffs, when that happened, when the threat, and India was much better positioned because it started out at 20 something to start with. Now we end up at 50, but Vietnam start at the 40 position, and it was one of the first country that no matter what, we want to be the first to strike a deal. Now there's no deal between Vietnam and the US just yet. There's no signed deal. But what is
It's a truce.
But what is the impact of that? The impact of that is that when President Trump announced the tariffs in August, Vietnam is in the 20s. So the reality is, effectively, when it goes into effect, but even without the deal signed, so even Korea, for example, is still negotiating, but it's having 15%. It doesn't have 15% for auto, but for the reciprocal tariff, that's what's facing. So I do think it's just the way you look at it, right? Are these actually comprehensive trade deals that has to be negotiated on a super granular level? Or is the goal is just to get as low as possible, and then we talk about the granularity later, right? And I think that's what some countries have a very different approach. So for Vietnam, the approach is, well, let's just get the emergency situation out of the way, and then let's talk about the details, which we can drag out. And the reality is that reciprocal tariffs is not the only thing Trump is doing. As you know, he announced Sections 232s. And even pharma, it's not impacting the US because it's only patented pharma, which he then negotiated with Pfizer to then having, so it's an evolving situation. And I do think the way a lot of the Asian countries deal with Trump is that he ideologically likes tariffs, but he's not set on the number. He's not set on the kinds. He does have certain ideas of sectors he thinks, but these things are flexible. And what you really want is really not have your country as the target, right? Of very high tariffs. And you fix on the details later. And I do think that that's an approach a lot of the Asian countries have taken, particularly the Southeast Asian countries. And I think it's not to say that's the right or the wrong approach, but everything is up in the air. Right? We have the Supreme Court ruling on reciprocal tariffs, IEPA, and it's really the sectoral tariffs are very deep and they can be very wide-ranging. And so in this environment, that's exactly what they're doing. What should India do? It's not for me to say, but the reality is that it's considering it from a different position. A lot of the Asian countries consider it because even before Trump came out with the tariffs, if you were to stack a chart on exposure in the US, it'll be like this with Vietnam on this end and then India, Indonesia, Australia here. They've always been a low manufacturing trading regime where a lot of the countries that I mentioned. And so obviously the considerations are very different. But as we talk about is that if you want to change things and want to get lots of jobs, the sectors heavily impacted are labor intensive. They have not been the sectors that have been very sexy for India. A good example, if you look at PLI, which the government is scaling back on because the success it hasn't been so great. But even that, the allocation of that program is primarily for all the sectors that have been much protected, right? Auto and so on and so forth. Whereas labor intensive hasn't been where you can absorb most of the jobs and skilled workers haven't been really a key priority. And actually, the global share has gone down. And now that they have been affected by tariffs, because the rest of the sectors are exempt, like pharma, ICT, so on and so forth. These energy, they're all exempted via reciprocal tariffs. Um, you still don't see that urgency. And like a good example is in the GST reforms, things are getting rationalized, but clothing and footwear above 20 now get a higher tariff, right? And these actually the export oriented, right? The higher value item. So I do think that fundamentally there has to be a shift in mindset that while India is shielded from this because of its low share of exposure, what it really needs is it's to be less shielded, right? To be much more exposed because you have more skin in the game. And the fact that it didn't is why it's so protected and it doesn't care as much. And it can say, well, whatever Trump does doesn't matter. But I think fundamentally that's the challenge, is that the biggest importer in the world, which is your biggest customer, and they just put you 50% tariffs. And actually, that's a rounding error.
Yeah.
It has negligible impact on India, except for the sectors mentioned and for the state exposed that have been trying really hard to grow this. And that's a challenge. And the question is that it's not to turn its back on it, but to actually work hard to grow that further.
Right. As you said, Trump uses tariffs. What you were indicating was that he often uses tariffs as a lever, right? And that it's very important to think about tariffs and these trade negotiations that are happening directionally in terms of the big overview of things and not get into the granularity at this point so much, right? When it comes to Russian oil, right? I mean, in terms of the headlines and the optics, it really reached a breaking point. I mean, to the extent that Trump tweeted a photo of Prime Minister Modi with Xi and Putin and tweeted like it was the end of the world. India obviously is going to buy Russian oil. I mean, our oil which is cheapest and most easily available to it, right? I mean, the West may be looking at it, Russia as an enemy, but India is not. And that kind of puts India in a tricky position. What do you what do you have to say about that?
Okay, so the Russian oil thing. So first, I think, right. I think from the Indian perspective, obviously you can see that's unfair because China also does that, and some countries in Europe are still doing that, right? Like Hungary is an example. And so how are we going to resolve this issue here? I guess big picture. Who are the ones getting 50%? If you add China 1.0 and Trump 1.0 and 2.0, which is this term, it's roughly 50% tariffs on China. Brazil's getting 50 and India's 50. So there are two schools of thoughts. One is Trump is going hard on those that he thinks opposes the U.S., right? So punishment to those that think that is going against, actively going against U.S. interests, right? Just very much the opposite is China is rewarding those that's going against the U.S., which is Russia and so on and so forth, right? So that's one school of thought. So India shifting a bit can help. So a good example is that there was that phone call on BRICS that while Prime Minister Modi went to China afterwards and very warm up relation, he's actually avoiding that BRICS call, right? But the reality is BRICS has I in it, and that's India, right? And it's not in India's interest to exit it since it's been very vocal about being part of it. And the fact is, with 50% tariffs and that it feels so unfair, it's actually going faster towards that direction and finding other partners, right? The second aspect is the Russian oil is that one of the things that Trump has asked the EU is that if we were going to go on this really hardcore secondary sanctions, will you sanction also China, right? And the countries involved, which obviously for the EU, that is a very difficult thing to do because it does a lot of trade and investment with China, and it's not in its interest to do that, right? So which can be a way for eventually for this to be pulled back, right? Because if fundamentally the secondary sanctions are going to be involving everyone, right? Then potentially, then perhaps it can just disappear as fast. It rises. But if we're in the first case where Trump sees that part of the BRICS and that the 50% is this bigger, then we have a bigger problem, right? So I don't actually have an answer to that. I do think that fundamentally this should go lower to 25%. But the reality is that given the fact that India exposure to the US is pretty low, and in US exposure to India is pretty low, even with the 50% tariffs, there is incentive to lower. But there is also not a lot of incentive as
Right.
well, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I think that's a challenge, right? Where you have countries that are much more intertwined, and that you have a much greater urgency, right? So we are now in October. The tariffs went into effect in August. There are talks of negotiating down the tariffs, but the urgency to do that is not like there's fire in the house, right?
Right.
There's pain, but for both sides. So I do think that that's the danger. Is the
Right,
danger is
right.
that you can let this smolder, and so how do I address that? I think it's a very difficult one, but let's just hope that it just will disappear as fast as it goes away. But I think we're also, and I think the big question here is that can India have its cake and eat it too? And I think Trump is saying no. And the reality is that, and India says no too, which means that the consequence of it is going to be negative for both.
I understand, Trent, that you're on a very short trip to India and we're short in time. So, one last question to you, and this is a complete hypothetical question. If you're advising the Finance Ministry of India today, what would be the biggest decision or the biggest direction in which you'd ask the Finance Ministry to go for the next 5 years?
I would ask the finance minister to have much greater policy risk appetite, right?
Right.
A good example I would say is that, if we were to look at what the tariffs have been on the sectors, I would imagine that we should have much lower tariffs for the textile sector, for example, affected. The fact that tariffs for them went from 12% to 18% for the above $29, I think that is something that should be raised. But that's a minor detail. Let's just scratch that and just think about the risk appetite in terms of asking the bigger questions. The bigger question is that, what can we do to really fire the engine of private sector in India? And I think that will take many levers of implementing those labor reforms, the simplification of code, levers of aggressively pursuing trade, right? So not giving it up on it just because it's poke its head out the window, looking at global trade, and then the door is like shut a bit. It should look for many doors. I give you an example. The fact is that India trade with many of those in Asia remains very minuscule, right? FDI, the trade deficit with China is huge. Investment is very limited. Investment in Japan can grow. Investment with South Korea can grow. Investment with Southeast Asia can grow.
Right.
Integration. And we're talking about goods. What about people? Right? Tourism inflows, could grow. So I would say that greater risk appetite, some more liberalization is needed. This may sound a bit difficult because coming here you have to do a lot of visas, but a lot of the Southeast Asian countries have completely liberalized visa arrivals for the Chinese, for example, and so on and so forth. I think that that's a bit kind of a big, huge risk. It doesn't have to go that far, but it could make it much easier. And I would say that would be my number one advice. It's that there's a lot of lower hanging fruits of reforms. And instead of fearing the outside, of what we can bring, which is, terrorism and so on and so forth, which we can have experienced here very recently, but so has Cambodia and Thailand. They have this huge border conflict, right? But, there's still huge mobility of people and trade and investment that's happening. And I do think that there's a lot of room to take much greater risk. And that would be my number one advice, is to not be so fearful of the world, even if it's changing. And there is a lot of room here to move. And there's a lot to move within India, the mobility and so on and so forth. So that would be my number one advice.
Okay.
And a country, I would say, for India to look, even though it's very different. It's
Right.
there's great complexity in India because it's very diverse, in terms of religion and people and so forth. Is Vietnam. It completely redrew the map, literally.
Yeah.
The provinces have shrunk. They have completely changed all the reforms. And I think they did it because there was so much pressure, being pressured by China, being pressured by the world.
Right.
And I think that is something that India can do. It can use opportunity. It can use Trump as an excuse to really implement a lot of these domestic reforms that may have not been palatable, and the risk appetite to that was limited. But given the fact that policy environments have changed, and so amidst this challenge, the opportunity is opening, right? The opening for the domestic to also demand this, which they would absorb it much better. And the costs of that, in my opinion, are not as high, right?
Right. Trin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. It was a pleasure to have you in the newsroom, and we hope that you visit us again soon.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
so much.
much.
Thank you.